Hi guys, we're going to talk about circulatory systems today. So mainly it's going to be about why organisms need a circulatory system and how those circulatory systems work. In order to consider why you need a circulatory system, you need to consider a single cell first, and then understand that a single cell's requirements are pretty similar to the requirements of whole organisms. So you have a cell here. Now the cell is alive, the cell is living because it has a way to make energy. Well, not make energy, but release it from other molecules. Okay? And the way it has that energy, and well, the main thing is it has energy, and the energy it uses to drive metabolic reactions. And essentially, if you keep driving those metabolic reactions, that is essentially the process of life in the cell. Okay? And by extension, even whole organisms. So that energy, the energy that is used to drive those metabolic reactions, that is used to drive the functions of life, that comes from ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, ATP is produced thanks to the process of respiration, aerobic respiration. Okay? But in order for respiration to produce this molecule, it needs certain inputs, and those inputs come from the environment. And this is where our dependency on the environment comes. Okay? Because in order for respiration to effectively happen, we need the continued supply of glucose. Okay? And we need the continued supply of oxygen. Yeah? So glucose and oxygen are required, and if we supply those things continuously, we will be able to continuously produce ATP, which continuously gets used up in order to drive metabolic reactions needed for life. Problem is that we are also, in this process, we also produce a significant waste product, carbon dioxide. And if carbon dioxide concentrations are allowed to build up in and around the cell, it's going to lead to a reduction in pH. So CO2 causes reduction in pH, and that's eventually going to affect proteins. Because if you reduce the pH too low, it will become highly acidic, and in a highly acidic environment, the proteins will stop functioning. Okay? Proteins stop functioning, and essentially all those metabolic reactions that are driven by enzymes, they will stop because they are proteins, they can't work anymore. Basic point being, in order for this process to continue, we need, as well as effective supply of oxygen and glucose, we need effective removal of waste products, including carbon dioxide. Okay? And in order to make this happen effectively, organisms have evolved different systems according to their size. Because the movement of these things, so I'm going to remove this now. Okay, so why oxygen is here, glucose is here. Now, oxygen is continuously being used up in the cell. Okay, So therefore, its concentration in the cell is relatively low. So oxygen has a concentration gradient. And therefore, outside of the cell, there could be lots of oxygen. Inside the cell, oxygen is continuously being used up. Remember, oxygen is going to go in this process, and carbon dioxide is going to come out. So oxygen has a concentration gradient. It will diffuse, and I'll show diffusion as a dotted line. Okay? So oxygen has a concentration gradient, and oxygen diffuses into the cell. Glucose, similarly, glucose is also used up inside the cell, and therefore its concentration at any one time in the cell is going to be low relative to outside of the cell. So glucose also diffuses along the concentration gradient, down the concentration gradient if you want, into the cell. Okay? Meanwhile, the continuous process of respiration is resulting in the buildup of carbon dioxide in the cell. So because carbon dioxide is continuously being produced in the cell, its concentration is high. So concentration of CO2 is high inside the cell compared to the outside, which is relatively low. So CO2 has a tendency to diffuse out of cells. Organisms that have a high surface area to volume ratio have a high rate of diffusion, and this is enough to supply oxygen and glucose and remove waste. For example, carbon dioxide. Okay? So when the situation is a single cell, it has a high surface area to volume ratio, and because of that, the rate of diffusion is high enough to effectively supply oxygen and glucose, and to effectively or efficiently remove wastes such as carbon dioxide. Now let's look at the situation when there's more cells, what the situation is going to be then. Okay. So this is now the situation in a multicellular organism. Even if the organism is small, as long as it's multicellular, this is the picture that we could be looking at. Okay? So what we need to make a few assumptions about the multicellular organism is that a multicellular organism has a low surface area compared to its volume. These cells on the surface can exchange freely with the environment. However, the cells in the interior cannot. Okay? So, effectively that's saying that this organism has a low surface area to volume ratio. So, low surface area to volume ratio. Okay? But each individual cell still has to go through the same processes as what we discussed before. So each of these cells needs oxygen and glucose from the environment and needs to remove carbon dioxide. So on the surface, these cells may find it easy to do that. Oxygen diffuses in, glucose diffuses in, carbon dioxide diffuses out, down the concentration gradients, because of respiration happening in the cell. Okay? However, cells in the interior of the organism might not be able to carry out this process as effectively. For example, this cell right here. This cell requires oxygen, but the concentration of oxygen here is going to be not very high, because oxygen is being used up by the cells near the surface of the organism. Okay? Okay, so oxygen concentrations in the interior are going to be low. What happens is therefore that there's a very little concentration gradient going into the cell. And so the rate of diffusion of oxygen here is low. Okay? So we have low rate of diffusion in some parts of the organism. Okay? Also, the cell is respiratory, and so the CO2 concentration is building up. And because the CO2 has to diffuse a great distance, and there's CO2 coming from all the cells diffusing out, the CO2 doesn't have an effective route for diffusion, or its diffusion path is now very long, has to diffuse a long way to go out. So the diffusion pathway is long, and so the rate of diffusion is low. Okay? Diffusion pathway is long, or relatively longer, and so these things combine to give, again, a low rate of diffusion. And so what happens is that if you don't have an effective circulatory system in these organisms, there's not effective supply of oxygen, there's not an effective removal of waste products, and so not all cells are going to get an effective supply of the requirements for respiration, as well as that the CO2 concentration is going to build up and potentially lower the pH to affect the proteins of the cell. And so we have an inadequate supply of glucose, oxygen, and inadequate removal of wastes such as CO2. Okay, so now the next thing is, if diffusion is inadequate, then how does mass flow improve the supply of oxygen and removal of waste? The simplest way is in an open circulatory system, where you have a very basic tissue that organ that acts as a pump. So I'll simplify that and just draw a heart, and it's essentially all it's doing is expanding or contracting and relaxing. Okay, it's contracting and relaxing. When it contracts, it forces fluid out over the cells, past the cells. And when it relaxes, that fluid is drawn back in. So what this does effectively, you've got an organ that is increasing pressure. So you've got an area of high pressure. You're going to have an area of low pressure where it's pumping fluid into. So essentially, you've got an area of high pressure, you've got an area of low pressure, and thus you have a pressure gradient. And just like concentration gradients make diffusion happen, a pressure gradient makes mass flow happen. Now, this is one step more active than the passive diffusion. So diffusion is passive, you wait for molecules or atoms to randomly move around down their concentration gradient. Mass flow is actively generating pressure to make fluid physically move and therefore improve the movement of atoms and molecules to regions of their lower concentration. So what's happening is that because this fluid is constantly in motion, when the heart contracts, it forces fluid out. When it relaxes, fluid is drawn back in. And so the fluid with the high concentration of oxygen at the edges mixes with the fluid with high concentration of carbon dioxide. So what happens is that overall, the oxygen concentration is allowed to build up, in the interior of the organism, and the CO2 concentration is allowed to get lower because the CO2 concentration at the surface is very low because it's able to actively exchange with the surface, and so you get much lower concentration of CO2 in the interior, allowing then the CO2 in the interior cells to diffuse out. You've got much higher concentration now of oxygen because of the movement of the fluid, allowing the concentrations to equalize, and therefore the oxygen concentration even in the interior, the fluid surrounding the interior cells is high, and so oxygen can diffuse into the cells. Okay, so this is our first introduction to mass flow, but the concept is going to be similar in all the circulatory systems. You've got an organ that is contracting and relaxing, it's generating pressure. The pressure creates a pressure gradient, and the pressure gradient allows mass flow, and the mass flow allows the concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide to be such around the cells that it improves or increases the rate of diffusion. Okay? So mass flow in an open circulatory system, allows the fluid around cells to mix, okay, to allow effective diffusion for all cells, not just the ones at the surface. Yeah? Because the fluid around these cells has high oxygen, has low carbon dioxide. The contracting and relaxing of the heart allows that fluid to mix with the fluid here, which doesn't have as good an exchange rate, and so we get mixing of that fluid, and so even around these cells we get good effective concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide to allow the diffusion to happen. Next we'll look at the closed circulatory system and how that improves things one step further. So here now we have a closed circulatory system, and what you have to be thinking about here is that as organisms get more complex, they are more active, they have higher energy demands, so the circulatory system has to become more and more effective. So we saw for single cells how the simple process of diffusion was sufficient to supply and remove substances, and then we saw for very basic multicellular organisms how the open circulatory system was sufficient to supply and remove substances. So a closed circulatory system has as its basic components a heart, pump, organ. It has a fluid that acts as the transport medium. And it has blood vessels. And this is the key point now. Okay? Has blood vessels. And the blood vessels essentially move or are very close to the cells which need to be supplied and from which substances need to be removed. An exchange organ is specialized to add oxygen into the blood and remove carbon dioxide. But what advantage closed circulatory system has over open circulatory system is because we've got the fluid enclosed in blood vessels, the blood is under a higher pressure. The blood is under a higher pressure, and therefore the supply and removal of substances is more efficient. Okay? We can generate higher pressures, we can therefore move the fluid faster, and what this means is the concentration gradients are maintained more effectively. Is that it? The concentration gradients are maintained more, or concentration gradients are higher. Because we have more effective supply of oxygen, the oxygen around the cells is going to be at a higher concentration. And because we've got that faster flow, the removal of the carbon dioxide is going to be also more effective. And so the concentration gradient for carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the cell is higher. The concentration gradient for oxygen to diffuse into the cell is also higher, and therefore the rate of diffusion is higher because of the closed circulatory system. So higher rate of diffusion due to higher concentration gradient. Okay, so given even more complex organisms and given even higher energy demands, how do organisms evolve to deal with that? So we have this closed circulatory system. It's increased in efficiency compared to the open circulatory system, but its efficiency can be maximized even further. Now, one way to increase the efficiency of the supply would be to raise the pressure at which the fluid is flowing. But at some point, the pressure is going to be too high for the exchange organ, okay? So if you increase the pressure too high in a single circulatory system like this one, right? So important points are that high pressures can cause damage to the exchange organ. Can cause damage to the exchange organ. So how do you allow greater pressure within the transport system or within the circulatory system without damaging your exchange organ? And that is when the double circulatory system comes in. So the double circulatory system has a separate circulation at a lower pressure to the exchange organ, and then at a much higher pressure for the rest of the body to supply the oxygenated blood. And in this way, you can allow organisms to evolve that have much greater energy demands and have a greater capacity to develop things like an advanced nervous system, muscular movement, and so on. So finally, we have the most efficient circulatory system, the double circulatory system, and we have cells indicated here which are demanding the oxygen, producing carbon dioxide to be removed. Now, the main point here is that you have a left side of the heart which is much more muscular, okay? Much more muscular than the right side of the heart. Why is that? The right side of the heart has to pump blood to the lungs, okay, via the pulmonary artery, but it shouldn't do this at too high a pressure. So, right side pumps blood at relatively a lower pressure compared to the left side. Compared to the left side, okay, because the distance is less, yeah, short distance to lungs, short distance to lungs, but also to prevent damage to the lungs. prevent damage to the lungs, okay? But once that blood comes back oxygenated, then the left side can pump it at a much higher pressure, remember, for all those tissues that demand oxygen. So brain, muscles, cells of the nervous system, all your body cells requiring oxygen, you know, at a very high rate. Okay, so, and then, okay, left side pumps at higher pressure, mainly because it has to pump a much greater distance, okay, so to overcome the resistance from all the blood vessels, okay, so greater distance, but also to maintain the efficient supply of oxygen, glucose, and removal of wastes such as carbon dioxide. Okay, so remember why this system works, the basic principles. You generate pressure here, the fluid in the vessels can maintain that pressure. So we've got high pressure gradient, mass flow. The mass flow ensures that we've got a good supply of oxygen here, so we get a high concentration of oxygen in and around these cells. If we maintain a high concentration of oxygen in and around these cells, we are maintaining the concentration gradient. And by maintaining the concentration gradient, we ensure continuous diffusion into the cells. Yeah? And by that same principle then, we allow the continuous removal of carbon dioxide. Yeah? Continuous removal of carbon dioxide means that the carbon dioxide levels around the cells are low. CO2 then can continuously diffuse out of the cells into the blood vessels and be removed. That is circulatory system.